Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Right, and we're so glad you're joining us for this.
Yeah. Usually when we think about ancient history, we picture, ruins.
Oh, sure.
So,
We get the pristine white statues.
exactly. Crumbling white marble pillars, dusty roads, statues of people wearing togas, living these very quiet, highly philosophical lives.
Right, very serene.
Very serene. And it feels incredibly distant, completely disconnected from the buzz of your smartphone or, the stress of your morning commute or the toxic politics of your
It
office.
feels like a different planet.
It really does. But then you start reading the letters of the Apostle Paul to the city of Corinth, and that whole illusion of a quiet ancient world just shatters completely.
Oh, completely. It's a mess.
It is. Suddenly you realize human nature hasn't changed a single bit in 2 millennia. I mean, we are looking at a community that is profoundly fractured.
Yeah, obsessed with status.
Yes, struggling with massive egos, and they are basically trying to figure out how to live together without tearing each other apart.
Which sounds pretty familiar.
It is a very loud, very messy, and very recognizable picture for anyone living today.
And, that messiness is exactly why this text is so vital for a modern listener. The beauty of this particular deep dive is that we are looking at the actual mechanics of how to solve that mess.
Right.
We're going to extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the life application from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, specifically looking at chapters 12 through 16.
So we're really getting into the back half of the letter here.
Yeah, the heavy stuff. And the insights here don't just apply to ancient ecclesiastical history. They provide a psychological and sociological blueprint.
A blueprint for what, exactly?
For how communities, modern corporate workplaces, intimate relationships, how they can actually thrive today rather than just barely surviving.
Okay, so for you listening, whether you're, managing a remote team of software developers, or trying to keep your extended family from going to war over the holidays, or just navigating this highly polarized digital world we live in, the core issues Paul is tackling here are your issues.
Absolutely. They're universal.
Status seeking, handling deep ideological divides, dealing with really uncomfortable traditional texts, and the search for authentic love.
Yeah.
These are the currents you swim in every single day.
Yeah, you can't escape them.
But before we get into the how of Paul's solutions, we really have to understand the where and the why. Set the scene for us. What were the actual mechanics of first century Corinth? Why was it such a pressure cooker?
Well, to understand Corinth, you really have to look at its geography. It was a bustling, highly cosmopolitan Greek metropolis.
Okay.
And it was situated on this very narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece.
Like a land bridge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this geographical choke point meant it had 2 major ports, one facing east towards Asia, the other west towards Italy.
So it's a massive hub.
Huge. Instead of sailing all the way around the treacherous southern coast of Greece, merchants would literally drag their ships.
Wait, drag their ships over the land?
Literally drag them across this narrow strip of land on a paved trackway called the Diolkos. Because of this, Corinth completely controlled the trade of the ancient Mediterranean.
Wow.
Wealth, trade goods, wildly diverse cultures from all over the known world. They collided there on a daily basis.
Okay, so I'm picturing kind of a mix of modern-day Wall Street, Las Vegas, and maybe a massive international airport.
That is a perfect analogy.
It's just a transient, high-energy, high-stakes environment.
Yeah, it was incredibly wealthy, it was intellectually proud, and it was fiercely competitive. There was an intense upward mobility in Corinth that you just didn't see in older aristocratic cities like Athens.
Because it's a newer money kind of town.
Exactly. Many of its citizens were freedmen, former slaves, who had made absolute fortunes in business. So you had this nouveau riche culture where everyone was constantly trying to prove their status.
Right, showing off the wealth.
Showing off their wealth, outspeaking each other in public forums. And the Christian church that had formed there didn't magically escape that environment.
Oh, of course not. They were swimming in the same water.
Right. They reflected that exact same hyper-competitive culture. According to our historical sources, particularly the extensive 18th and 19th century commentaries by Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry.
Great sources, by the way.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
They point out that this was a community richly endowed with talents and spiritual gifts, but they were weaponizing those gifts.
Weaponizing them to compete with one another.
Exactly. They were bringing the status-obsessed, ladder-climbing culture of the Corinthian streets right through the doors of their gatherings.
So it's the classic scenario of a group of highly talented, aggressive people who all want to be the CEO.
Yes.
And absolutely no one wants to do the administrative work.
Nobody wants to take out the trash.
Right. Which brings us to the first major hurdle Paul has to clear here: the anatomy of community and the myth of independence. To solve the chaos in Corinth, he has to completely deconstruct how the community is valuing its members.
He has to tear it all down.
Yeah, he has to move them from a status-based hierarchy, which they absorbed from their city, to an organic, interdependent whole. And he tackles this in chapter 12 by introducing the concept of spiritual gifts.
Right. And the Greek word Paul uses here is charismata.
Charismata.
Yeah, these were special abilities or endowments given to the members of the community. Things like extraordinary wisdom, deep knowledge, the ability to heal the sick, working miracles, prophecy.
And speaking in tongues, right.
Yeah, speaking in different languages or ecstatic tongues. But Paul's problem wasn't a lack of these gifts. The problem was the Corinthian ranking system.
Okay, the hierarchy again.
They were treating these charismata like modern luxury watches or designer labels. If you possessed a flashy, highly public gift, like speaking in tongues, you fundamentally looked down on the person whose gift was just, quietly organizing the meals or helping the poor.
Which is such an innate human flaw. I mean, we automatically rank things by visibility. The person on stage gets the applause.
Always.
The person running the soundboard, they only get noticed if the microphone feeds back.
That's so true. But Paul completely undercuts this human tendency to rank by visibility. He points out two foundational truths to dismantle their hierarchy.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, as the commentaries highlight, all these diverse, seemingly unequal gifts come from the exact same source. Paul writes, there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are differences of administrations, but the same Lord.
So it levels the playing field.
Completely. The person speaking in tongues and the person serving the food both receive their assignment from the exact same divine authority. You can't claim superiority if your gift was handed to you just like everyone else's.
Right. You didn't earn it. It was a grant. And that leads right into the second foundational truth, which Matthew Henry emphasizes so strongly in his commentary.
Yeah, Henry really nails this.
He says these gifts, these talents, whether we are talking about ancient spiritual endowments or modern intellectual abilities, they are not given for personal ostentation.
They absolutely are not. Henry notes that they aren't given so you can build a personal following. They are given, using the older English phrasing of the text, to profit withal.
To profit withal, meaning for everyone's benefit.
Exactly. It means they are bestowed strictly for the common good, to build up the entire community. Your brilliance isn't for you. It's a tool given to you to serve the person sitting next to you.
I really want to spend some time unpacking the metaphor Paul uses to explain this, because it's arguably one of the most famous sociological concepts in Western literature.
The body metaphor.
Yes, the metaphor of the human body. He says the community is one single body with many distinct members: a foot, a hand, an ear, an eye.
And he uses this brilliant, almost satirical logic to expose how ridiculous their divisions are.
Right. It's actually pretty funny if you read it closely.
It is. He says, imagine if the foot said, because I am not the hand, I am not part of the body. Or if the ear said, because I am not the eye, I don't belong. Paul is directly addressing the inferiority complex here. Just because you don't have the flashy role doesn't disconnect you from the organism.
Yeah.
And then he flips it to address the superiority complex. He asks, what if the whole body were just an eye? Where would the hearing be? What if the whole body were just a giant ear? How would it smell anything?
I've always loved that image because it forces the reader to visualize something completely absurd. Imagine a giant, blinking, 6-foot-tall eye rolling down the paved streets of ancient Corinth.
It's monstrous.
It's a monster. It's useless. It can't walk. It can't eat. It can't survive.
That absurdity is exactly Paul's point. A community entirely composed of charismatic leaders with no support structure is a monster that will quickly starve to death.
Okay, let's translate this into a 21st century reality so the listener can really feel the weight of it.
Sure, let's bring it into the modern workplace.
Yeah, think about a modern, high-growth tech company. You have the high-profile, superstar software engineers, the eyes.
Right, the ones making the big salaries.
Exactly. They are highly visible. They are writing the code, building the shiny new product that gets featured in magazines, And in corporate culture, they might be tempted to look down on the customer support team, the feet,
Oh, absolutely.
the people who are dealing with the daily, unglamorous grind of angry users resetting their passwords. But if the whole company is just engineers, and there's no customer support to retain the users, no HR to manage the payroll, no janitorial staff to keep the building functional, the entire company collapses within a month.
In the Corinthian church, the people with the highly visible verbal gifts were essentially the arrogant lead engineers looking down on the maintenance staff.
Exactly.
But Paul pushes this anatomical metaphor even further to secure his point. He says the parts of the body that we perceive to be less honorable or more feeble are actually the most necessary.
The most necessary.
Yeah. Think about your own body. You can survive without a hand or an eye or a foot. Those are external, visible, and somewhat expendable. You cannot survive for 5 minutes without a heart or lungs or a liver.
Wow, right.
And where are those organs? They're hidden away deep inside the body, completely invisible to the outside world.
That is a staggering way to reframe value. The invisible things are what keep you alive.
Barnes notes this beautifully in his 19th century commentary. He says the retiring, quiet members of a community who are perhaps just praying, offering unseen help, or quietly managing the logistics, they are the vital organs of that community. If you remove the flashy speaker, the community might be less entertained. If you remove the quiet, unseen caregivers, the community dies.
Let me play devil's advocate for a moment here, because this concept is incredibly difficult for a modern listener to swallow. The air we breathe in our culture constantly tells us to build our personal brand.
Oh, constantly. Optimize yourself.
Right. We are told to be the star, to stand out, to optimize our own lives, and to make sure we get the credit for our innovations. Isn't Paul's message here a direct assault on modern individualism? Like he's fundamentally saying, you are not the main character of reality.
Oh, he's completely dismantling what we could call the myth of independence. We love to view ourselves as self-sufficient units, completely autonomous individuals who only choose to interact with others when a transaction benefits us.
Yeah, a very transactional mindset.
But Paul is arguing that this is a biological and spiritual lie. You are essentially inextricably connected. The text explicitly says the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. No one in a functioning community is redundant, and absolutely no one is self-sufficient.
The psychological relief of that truth is immense, though.
How so?
Well, when you internalize that you are a necessary part of a larger organism, it destroys two major neuroses at the exact same time. It destroys pride on one side, and it destroys depression or feelings of worthlessness on the other.
That's a great point. Consider the mechanics of that. You shouldn't be arrogant if you are the eye, because you didn't invent your own eyesight. The genetic code, or in this context, God, gave you that capacity. You are simply utilizing a tool you were handed.
Right.
Conversely, you shouldn't fall into despair if you are the foot, because the designer intentionally placed you there, and the entire body would be crippled without you. You don't have to be everything, you just have to be your part.
That brings us to a specific practical reflection for you, the listener.
Yes, let's make this practical.
Look at the ecosystems you inhabit, your neighborhood, your family unit, or your workplace. Are you secretly walking around with the attitude of, I have no need of you, towards someone whose role is less visible or less glamorous than yours?
That's a tough question to ask yourself.
It is. Are you treating the customer service rep, the person who delivers your packages, or the quiet relative who always cleans up after dinner as if they are a lesser part of the organism?
Yeah.
Your challenge this week is to actively reframe their contribution as a vital organ. How can you verbally or practically acknowledge their absolute necessity to your survival?
But here's the inherent flaw if we stop the analysis right here. You can cognitively know that the customer service rep is just as vital as the lead engineer, but that intellectual knowledge doesn't magically stop the engineer's ego from swelling.
Right, knowing it isn't the same as living it.
Exactly. Knowing you are a connected body isn't enough to make you function like one. You need an immune system to keep the body from attacking itself.
An immune system.
Yeah. You need a circulatory system.
Yeah.
A lifeblood that pulses through every member and forces them to act in harmony. And for Paul, that lifeblood is the absolute prerequisite for any community to survive. He tackles this next in chapter 13.
Chapter 13, the heartbeat of it all, the more excellent way. I have to admit, I always chuckle a little bit when we approach this chapter.
Let me guess. Weddings.
Weddings. If you've attended a wedding anywhere in the Western world in the last 50 years, you have heard 1 Corinthians 13.
Oh, absolutely. Love is patient, love is kind.
Yes. It's cross-stitched onto living room pillows. It's read in hushed tones while people are gazing lovingly into each other's eyes, surrounded by flowers and bridesmaids.
It has been thoroughly romanticized and completely stripped of its teeth.
Which is a tragic misreading of the text. Contextually, Paul didn't write this poetic masterpiece for a pair of starry-eyed newlyweds.
Not at all.
He wrote it as a severe, desperately needed medical intervention for a church that was actively cannibalizing itself.
Right. He's essentially saying, you people are fighting over who is the most spiritually elite, and you are entirely missing the point of human existence.
So we are looking at the absolute supremacy of agape. That is the specific Greek word Paul deploys here. Order translations like the King James Version translate it as charity, while modern versions universally use love.
But as Barnes's commentary is careful to point out, we have to strip away our modern baggage from both of those words.
Because we hear charity and think of a tax write-off.
Exactly. It's not charity in the modern sense of writing a tax-deductible check to a nonprofit. And it's certainly not love in the sense of a warm, fuzzy, romantic chemical reaction in your brain.
So what are the actual mechanics of agape, like practically?
Agape is a radical, self-giving act of benevolence. It's an act of the will, a deliberate choice that seeks the highest possible good of the other person, regardless of whether they deserve it, whether they reciprocate it, or whether you even like them.
Wow. Even if you don't like them.
It is an unyielding commitment to the welfare of the other.
And Paul introduces this concept by dropping an absolute bomb on the Corinthians' pride.
Oh, he really does.
He takes all those flashy spiritual gifts they were bragging about from chapter 12, and he mathematically reduces them to zero if agape isn't present. He writes, "Even if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal."
We really need to unpack the historical mechanics of that metaphor, because it wasn't just a random musical reference. It was a deeply insulting cultural critique.
Wait, really? Insulting how?
Okay, so in ancient Corinth, there were numerous pagan mystery cults, notably the cult of Cybele, the Magna Mater.
Right.
Let's actually look at what a Cybele worship service sounded like. You had these priests known as the Galli, who would work themselves into an absolute ecstatic frenzy.
Okay.
As part of their rituals, they would clash these massive, heavy bronze cymbals called kimbala, along with gongs and drums, to drown out the cries of animal sacrifices and to induce a psychological trance state.
So it was just incredibly loud?
The noise was literally deafening, chaotic, and completely jarring.
Ah, so when Paul tells the Corinthians their loveless spirituality is just a clanging cymbal, he isn't just saying they are annoying.
No.
He's saying, without agape, your supposedly elite Christian worship looks and sounds exactly like the unhinged, bloody pagan cults down the street.
Yes. He is telling them that profound spiritual gifting minus love equals pagan noise.
Yeah.
You are giving yourself a headache and everyone else around you. The outward performance means absolutely nothing.
That is brutal. And he drives this point relentlessly. He continues, if I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but don't have love, I am nothing.
He takes it to the extreme.
And then he hits them with the ultimate paradox. If I give away all my goods to feed the poor, and if I give my body to be burned but don't have love, it profits me nothing.
Yeah, that's the one that really gets you.
It stops you in your tracks. You can be a literal martyr. You can liquidate your entire estate to solve world hunger, and it means nothing. How is that logically possible?
Because of the internal motive. This is the piercing psychological insight of the text. The outward action, no matter how extreme, sacrificial, or socially beneficial it appears, is entirely invalidated on a spiritual level if the internal mechanism is corrupted by ego.
If you're doing it for the likes.
Exactly. Henry's commentary notes that vain, glorious ostentation, doing extreme acts of charity, or even facing martyrdom just so history will remember you as a hero, or so your peers will view you as super spiritual, cancels out the spiritual benefit to your own soul.
Wow.
Love is the only animating force that gives an action internal weight. Without agape as the engine, you are a spiritual zero, no matter how impressive the vehicle looks.
So if agape isn't a feeling, and it isn't just extreme outward sacrifice for the sake of ego, what does it actually look like in the grit of the real world?
Well, Paul gives us a very specific list.
And it's crucial to note that in the original Greek text, these characteristics are verbs, not adjectives.
That's a great point. Love isn't a state of being. Love does things.
And love actively refrains from doing things. It suffers long, it is kind, it doesn't envy, it doesn't brag.
Let's examine the mechanics of a few of those verbs.
Yeah.
Take suffers long, which is usually translated as patient. The Greek word is makrothumai. It literally translates to long-tempered.
Oh, like the opposite of short-tempered.
The exact opposite of having a short fuse. It describes the capacity to bear with people's flaws, their provocations, and their outright injuries over a highly extended period without retaliating or blowing up. It is the endurance of the soul.
And then there is envieth not.
Right. Henry points out the internal logic here. If we truly possessed agape toward others, we would genuinely rejoice in their happiness and success.
Which is so hard to do.
So hard. We wouldn't be secretly bitter when a coworker gets the promotion we wanted, because agape means we want their highest good as much as our own.
He also says love does not behave itself inappropriately, it doesn't seek its own way, is not provoked. And here's the one that I think is the most devastatingly practical for modern relationships. It takes no account of evil, or, as the older translation renders it, thinks no evil.
The psychological depth of that phrase is staggering.
Unpack that for us.
Thinks no evil doesn't mean being naive. It doesn't mean you become a doormat, gullible to abuse or blind to actual harm. The commentaries, particularly Barnes, explain the accounting metaphor behind the Greek word logizetai.
Accounting metaphor.
Yeah, it means love does not keep a ledger.
Oh.
It doesn't keep a mental spreadsheet of every slight, every wrong word, every failure of a partner, waiting for the perfect tactical moment to bring it up in an argument 6 months later to win a fight.
Ouch. Yeah, we all do that. It also means not assuming the worst, right? Like if a colleague doesn't reply to your email, thinking no evil, means you assume they are swamped with work, rather than reasoning out a dark motive that they are intentionally ignoring you to sabotage your career.
Exactly. Agape defaults to the most charitable interpretation of someone else's actions.
This completely upends the value system of the ancient world, and frankly of our modern world too.
Consider the comparative insight with Greek values here. The Greeks prized profound intellect above almost everything.
Right. Philosophy, logic.
They prized rhetoric, the ability to speak beautifully and persuade a crowd. They loved the hidden mysteries of deep philosophy. And here comes Paul, an educated Jewish rabbi, writing to Greeks, saying that a single drop of self-giving, patient, unenvious agape outweighs the most towering intellect or the most silver-tongued orator in the empire.
He proves the superiority of love by pointing to its permanence. In verses 8 through 10, he contrasts the temporary nature of spiritual gifts with the eternal nature of agape. He says that prophecies will fail, tongues will cease, knowledge will vanish away.
Right. Why?
Because right now, human understanding is fundamentally limited. We only know in part. As Paul says, we see through a glass darkly.
Right, like looking into a poor quality ancient bronze mirror where the reflection is totally distorted.
Exactly. All these spectacular gifts, all our theology, all our deep knowledge are just temporary scaffolding used to build the community.
But when the building is finished, when eternity is realized, the scaffolding is completely unnecessary and gets torn down.
Yeah.
You won't need the gift of prophecy when you are standing in the presence of ultimate truth. But love never fails. Love isn't the scaffolding. Love is the environment.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. That's why he concludes the chapter by saying, now faith, hope, and love remain, but the greatest of these is love. Because logically, in eternity, you won't need faith, because you'll finally see what you believed in.
Right.
You won't need hope, because you will have attained what you hoped for. But you will always eternally need love. It is the very fabric of how conscious beings exist together in harmony.
Which is why this isn't just poetry. It's a mandate.
So here is your practical how-to for this monumental chapter. Sometime this week, you are going to be provoked.
It's inevitable.
By a colleague, by your spouse, by your kids, or by some stranger's infuriating post on social media. When that happens, test your reaction against this ancient list of verbs. Are you reasoning out evil about their motives? Are you opening up your mental ledger to add another tally mark to their debt?
Put away the spreadsheet.
Yes, put it away. Your practice is to assume the best possible motive for their actions and to intentionally respond with a long temper. Stop trying to be the smartest person in the argument and try being the most patient. See how it completely alters the dynamic of the conflict.
That is an incredibly challenging assignment. But it's necessary because Paul knows that abstract poetry about love is useless if it doesn't change behavior.
Right.
He now has to take this lofty standard of agape and apply it to the actual chaotic, messy reality of what happens when these specific, ego-driven Corinthians get together in a room. And that is what chapter 14 is all about.
Chaos, order, and uncomfortable texts.
The transition here is brilliant. He basically says, okay, you understand the theory of love. Now let's look at the mechanics of how love operates in a public meeting.
Right, where the rubber meets the road.
And the very first issue he attacks is their absolute obsession with speaking in tongues.
To understand the tension here, we need to realize that the Corinthians valued the spectacular over the useful.
Yes.
Speaking in an unknown language, whether that was an actual human language the speaker had never learned, or a sort of ecstatic, angelic, spiritual language, was highly prized.
Highly prized, because it looked incredibly mystical. It was an undeniable, visible marker of divine connection. In a culture obsessed with status, speaking in tongues was the ultimate spiritual flex.
The ultimate flex. But Paul applies the rule of agape to this practice, and the result is a complete paradigm shift. He says, "He who speaks in another language edifies himself, but he who prophesies edifies the assembly."
So the ultimate rule here is edification over ego.
And we need to understand that edification isn't just a stale religious word, is it?
No, not at all. The Greek root word is oikodome, which literally means architecture or building a house.
Building a house.
Yeah. Paul is looking at the Corinthians like a crew of construction workers who are swinging wrecking balls at their own job site just to show off how strong they are.
Wow.
He's saying, put the wrecking ball down and pick up a brick. Your goal is to build a structure that shelters people, not to perform for them.
That perfectly explains his preference for prophecy. In this specific context, prophecy doesn't necessarily mean predicting the future like a fortune teller.
Right, it's not crystal ball stuff.
It means speaking clear, understandable divine truth. It means interpreting scripture or sharing wisdom in the common language of the people in the room.
Because the audience can actually understand it and be built up by it. Barnes' commentary highlights a fantastic analogy Paul uses right in the text regarding a military trumpet.
Oh yeah, the bugle.
In the ancient world, before radio communication, armies relied on specific trumpet calls to maneuver in the chaos of battle. One sequence of notes meant advance, another meant retreat, another meant form a shield wall.
Makes sense.
Paul argues, if the trumpet gives an uncertain sound, if the bugler just stands there playing random atonal jazz notes to show off his lung capacity who will prepare for war, the army just stands there in confusion and gets slaughtered.
So if you are speaking a language no one understands, you are just showing off. You are, as the text bluntly puts it, speaking to the air.
Exactly. Let's modernize this.
Okay, yeah.
It's like a mid-level manager getting up in an all-hands meeting today and speaking entirely in complex, impenetrable industry jargon, throwing around acronyms just to sound like the smartest person in the room.
We've all been in that meeting.
While the rest of the staff sits there, completely lost on what the actual strategy is, love demands that you speak in a way that helps the listener, not in a way that glorifies the speaker.
This insistence on clarity naturally leads to Paul's insistence on order. The historical evidence suggests the Corinthian meetings were essentially a free-for-all.
Oh, total chaos.
You had multiple people standing up and shouting in ecstatic tongues at the exact same time, while others were trying to prophesy over the top of them, and others were probably arguing about what was just said. It was sensory overload.
It sounds exhausting. So Paul steps in as a structural engineer and institutes hard rules. Let 2 or 3 speak and do it sequentially, one by one.
Take turns.
Furthermore, if someone speaks in a tongue, there absolutely must be someone there to interpret it into Greek. Otherwise, sit down and keep silent.
And he makes a profound theological statement to back up these rules. He says, the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets.
This is a direct strike against those pagan mystery cults we discussed earlier.
Oh, right, the ones with the symbols.
Yes. In those cults, divine inspiration was often associated with a complete loss of bodily autonomy. The oracle or the priest would go into a frenzied, uncontrollable trance, foaming at the mouth, unable to stop themselves.
So the gods possess them, basically.
Right. But Paul is arguing that the Holy Spirit of the Judeo-Christian God does not operate by overriding human volition. Divine inspiration doesn't bypass your self-control.
If God gives you a message, you still have the capacity to wait your turn to deliver it.
Exactly. Why? Because, as Paul concludes, God is not the author of confusion, but of peace.
Okay, we need to take a deep breath because we're about to hit a massive, controversial speed bump for the modern listener. We cannot skip this.
Yeah, let's get into it.
In verses 34 and 35, right in the middle of this discourse on order, Paul suddenly commands women to be quiet in the assemblies. He says they are not permitted to speak, they are to be in submission. And if they want to learn something, they should ask their husbands at home because it is shameful for a woman to speak in church.
It's a tough passage.
Now, let's be entirely honest. For anyone listening today, this sounds completely repressive.
Absolutely.
It sounds like straightforward, ancient misogyny. How do we engage with this text without either blindly accepting a patriarchal silencing of women or just taking scissors to the page and tossing the text out because it offends modern sensibilities?
Well, it is arguably one of the most difficult texts in the New Testament, and it requires profound historical discernment. We have to look at the mechanics of the ancient world, the architecture of their meetings, and most importantly, the immediate literary context of Paul's own letter.
Right.
The 18th and 19th century commentators, despite living in highly patriarchal times themselves, noticed a glaring contextual clue that prevents a simplistic reading. Just 3 chapters earlier, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul spent an entire section laying out specific rules for how women should pray and prophesy in the public assembly.
Specifically regarding head coverings, right? Wait, let me make sure I'm following the logic here. In chapter 11, Paul acknowledges and regulates the fact that women were actively speaking, praying out loud, and prophesying in the middle of the church gatherings.
Exactly. So logically, he cannot be instituting an absolute universal ban on women opening their mouths in chapter 14.
Because he just gave them instructions on how to do it.
Right. If he were banning it completely, he would be directly contradicting his own instructions from a few pages earlier. He would be saying, here is how women should prophesy, but also women are never allowed to speak. Paul was a highly trained, logically rigorous thinker. He wouldn't make an error like that.
So what are the mechanics of what is actually happening in chapter 14? If he's not banning all speech, what specific speech is he shutting down?
We have to look at the physical architecture and the cultural format of a first-century gathering. These weren't quiet, passive rows of pews facing a pulpit like a modern cathedral.
Right.
These were house churches. And in the broader Greco-Roman and Jewish cultures, men and women often sat in separate areas of the room during worship.
Like men on one side, women on the other.
Yes. Furthermore, the teaching style wasn't a monologue. It was a dynamic rabbinic dialogue. The teacher would speak, and the audience was expected to interrupt, ask probing questions, and debate the interpretation.
Oh, I see where this is going.
It appears from the historical and textual context that some of the women in Corinth who were perhaps experiencing this, remember, he's just told the tongue speakers to sit down and the prophets to wait in line. He is acting as a traffic cop in a localized, chaotic intersection.
Yeah.
So he addresses this specific group of women and says, stop shouting across the room. Stop the disruptive public cross-examination. If you have a theological question about what is being taught, save the debate for the dinner table at home so the speaker can finish and the meeting can proceed in peace.
This distinction is so crucial for how we apply ancient texts today. Wisdom with discernment means we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we also don't wear first-century bathwater as perfume today.
That's a great way to put it.
We have to separate the enduring universal principle from the localized cultural application.
Exactly. The enduring wisdom here is that public gatherings should be orderly, respectful, and geared toward building everyone up without unnecessary cultural offense. The specific application telling these particular women to stop shouting questions was rooted in the social architecture of first-century Corinth.
Right. We must apply the principle of order and edification to our modern context, rather than blindly copy-pasting an ancient cultural corrective into a 21st century boardroom or church.
Establishing the bedrock of order and mutual respect is absolutely necessary because Paul is about to transition to the most profound, heavy-hitting theological argument in the entire letter.
Once he has corrected their chaotic behavior, he has to correct a foundational philosophical belief that holds their entire worldview together. Which brings us to chapter 15.
The ultimate hope.
Defeating the final enemy. We make a massive pivot here from how to conduct a meeting to the literal physical resurrection of the dead.
It's a huge shift.
It turns out, amidst all the chaos in Corinth, a faction of the community was going around teaching that there is no resurrection of the dead.
Yeah, and to understand why a group of early Christians would deny the resurrection, we again have to look deeply into the mechanics of the Greek mindset. The Corinthians were heavily influenced by pervasive Greek philosophies, particularly streams of thought like Platonism. In the Platonic worldview, reality was strictly divided into the material and the spiritual.
Dualism.
Exactly. The spiritual realm was pure, eternal, and good. The physical world, however, including the human body, was seen as inferior, corrupt, and essentially a prison. The Greeks had a famous rhyming pun, somasema.
Somasema, what does that mean?
It translates to, the body is a tomb.
Ah, so for a Greek philosopher, salvation didn't mean redeeming the body. Salvation meant the pure soul finally escaping the dirty physical body forever at the moment of death, floating off into the ethereal realm.
Precisely. So when Paul comes to town preaching the Christian doctrine of a bodily resurrection, the idea that God's ultimate plan is to raise the actual physical body back to life, it was deeply offensive to their philosophical sensibilities.
Unbelievable to them.
Totally. To the Greek mind, a bodily resurrection wasn't just scientifically unbelievable, it was absurd and undesirable. Why on earth would a liberated soul want to be shoved back into the prison cell of flesh and bone?
It's similar to how some modern tech utopians view the body today.
Oh, that's interesting. Like how?
Like as mere wetware, right?
Heh?
A fragile biological machine that we hopefully can discard once we figure out how to upload our consciousness to the cloud. The body is just a temporary, flawed vehicle.
It's a fascinating parallel.
Yeah.
But Paul violently disagrees with this dualism. He steps up and unleashes this relentless, logical sequence of dominoes to show the Corinthians why denying the physical resurrection destroys the entire foundation of their reality.
He uses a devastating logical progression. He says, okay, let's play out your Greek theory to its natural conclusion. If there is no such thing as a resurrection of the dead, then that means Christ himself wasn't raised.
Right.
And if Christ didn't rise from the dead, then our preaching is a lie and your faith is entirely empty. He goes even further. Yeah. You are still in your sins.
Because if Christ just died and stayed dead, he was just another martyr crushed by the Roman Empire. His sacrifice had no cosmic power to conquer death or sin.
Furthermore, all your friends and family members who have already died believing in this, they haven't ascended, they have simply perished into nothingness. And then he delivers what I think is one of the most sobering, emotionally raw lines in the entire New Testament.
Let's hear it.
If we have only hoped in Christ in this life, we are of all men most pitiable.
Wow. Let the weight of that phrase sink in. Most pitiable.
Yeah.
He's looking at a community that is facing social ostracization, potential persecution from the Roman authorities, striving to love their enemies, giving up their cultural status, all based on the promise of a coming kingdom.
And Paul is saying, if the resurrection is a myth, if this life is all there is, then being a Christian is the most pathetic, tragic life choice you could possibly make. You are sacrificing your only existence for a fairy tale.
But he doesn't leave them in that nihilistic despair. In verse 20, the tone shifts dramatically. He declares, but now Christ has been raised from the dead. He is the first fruits of those who are asleep.
First fruits. We need to understand the cultural metaphor there.
Right. It was a deeply ingrained Jewish agricultural concept. The very first part of the harvest that ripened in the field wasn't eaten. It was taken to the temple and offered to God as a pledge, a guarantee that the rest of the massive harvest was inevitably coming.
Like a down payment.
Exactly. By calling Christ the first fruits, Paul is saying that Jesus' resurrection isn't an isolated anomaly. It is the absolute guarantee that the rest of humanity's harvest is on the way.
But the Corinthians, being analytical Greeks, are still stuck on the logistics. They ask the natural, skeptical question. How are the dead raised up, and with what kind of body do they come?
The how.
Yeah. If the body decays into dust, or is eaten by animals, or is burned, how does it come back? And Paul answers this by using one of the most brilliant analogies in ancient literature, the metaphor of a seed.
Let's expand on the mechanics of this analogy.
Okay, imagine you had never seen a plant before in your entire life. You have absolutely no concept of botany.
Okay, tracking.
And someone hands you a hard, brown, dead-looking acorn, and they tell you to bury it in the dark dirt and leave it there. You would think they were crazy.
Sure.
To your eyes, burying that acorn is the end of its existence. It will just rot.
But we understand the mechanics of biology.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the seed actually has to die. It has to be buried. Its outer shell has to break apart and decay for the life inside to be activated.
Right. The sprout comes out of the death of the shell.
Now think about the continuity and the discontinuity. The mighty oak tree that eventually grows out of the ground looks absolutely nothing like the little brown acorn. The form is completely different.
But they are connected.
Yes. It is intrinsically genetically connected to it. The information of the oak tree was always inside the acorn. Paul is using this biological reality to explain the profound mystery of the resurrection.
He's saying, Your current physical body is the acorn. It is fragile, it gets sick, it ages, and eventually it has to be buried in the ground. But the resurrected body isn't a completely new, unrelated object that God creates from scratch. It is the mighty oak tree that was promised by the acorn. It's a continuum. God doesn't throw the physical body away because he hates matter. He upgrades its operating system.
That's beautifully said. The contrasts Paul draws here to explain this upgrade are incredibly poetic and powerful. He says the body is sown in corruption, but it is raised in incorruption.
Sown in dishonor.
Meaning the humiliation of death and decay.
Right.
But it is raised in glory, sown in weakness, raised in power, sown a natural body, raised a spiritual body.
Now, that phrase, spiritual body, sounds like an oxymoron. How can a body be spiritual?
Barnes' commentary is incredibly helpful here. A natural body, or soma psychikon in Greek, doesn't just mean physical. It means a body animated by natural, mortal life, suited for this current, decaying, earthly environment, inherited from the first man, Adam. A spiritual body, soma pneumatikon, doesn't mean a ghost made of mist. It means a solid physical body that is fully animated and sustained by the immortal spirit, perfectly suited for the eternal heavenly environment, inherited from the second man, Christ.
So it's a physical body just powered by a different energy source.
Exactly. Paul bluntly states that flesh and blood in its current fragile, corruptible state cannot inherit the kingdom of God. It wouldn't survive the transition. There must be a biological and spiritual transformation.
And this soaring theological argument peaks with what I believe is the most triumphant concept in the entire letter. Death itself is the last enemy to be destroyed.
This is a radical reframing of the human experience. Death is not a natural part of the cycle of life. It is not a friend that kindly ushers us into the next realm.
No.
Death is an invader. It is an enemy that shatters the unity of body and soul. But Paul argues, because of Christ's resurrection, it is a defeated enemy. It has been disarmed. Paul actually taunts it, quoting ancient scripture. "O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?"
The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law, but God gives us the victory through Christ.
Yes.
This ultimate cosmic victory over the grave provides the ultimate why for everything Paul has asked the Corinthians to do in the previous 14 chapters.
It connects everything.
Right. Why should you humble yourself and not demand the spotlight? Why should you practice painful, self-giving agape love toward people who annoy you? Why should you seek to build others up instead of building your own platform?
Why do any of it?
Because this short, mortal life is not the end of the story. Your actions, your character, your love, these things have eternal weight. They survive the grave.
Which brings us to the practical how-to for this monumental chapter. Because of this ultimate victory, Paul doesn't conclude by telling them to sit around and wait for heaven.
He gives them a job to do.
He concludes with a call to action in verse 58. "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing your labor is not in vain."
So as a listener, ask yourself this. If you truly, deeply believe that your positive actions, your sacrifices, your unseen acts of love, and your mundane daily work echo into eternity and are never, ever wasted, how would that change the work you do today?
That's the question.
How would it change the way you handle a frustrating, dead-end project at the office or a difficult, exhausting conversation with a teenager? If your labor isn't swallowed up by the grave, it gives immense dignity to your Tuesday mornings.
It changes your entire posture toward life. It removes the frantic desperation of feeling like you have to extract all your reward, all your recognition, and all your pleasure right here, right now, before you die.
You can afford to be patient.
You can afford to sacrifice because the ledger is balanced in eternity.
That is a profound psychological release. And it is the absolute perfect setup for how Paul ends the letter. We go from the highest heights of cosmic glory, the defeat of death, the eternal resurrected body, straight into the mundane logistics of chapter 16.
It is one of the most jarring yet brilliant juxtapositions in the New Testament.
It really is.
How do you follow the most triumphant, soaring chapter on life after death? By immediately talking about a fundraising collection.
I have to push back here because when you read it, it feels like a massive mood killer.
It does.
We just conquered death. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? And his very next sentence is, now concerning the collection for the saints. Hey, can you guys pass the hat? It feels like a telethon interrupting a symphony.
It absolutely feels like a sudden drop in altitude. But if you look closely, it is actually the profound physical realization of everything he just taught.
How so?
The theology of money is deeply tied to the theology of the resurrection. Here is the historical context. The Jewish Christians living in Jerusalem and Judea were suffering from a severe, historically documented famine, compounded by extreme poverty and persecution.
Oh, wow.
Paul is traveling around the Mediterranean, taking up a financial collection from the wealthy Gentile churches in places like Corinth to bring back to the starving Jewish believers.
So this isn't just a church building fund.
Not at all.
This is life or death for people hundreds of miles away.
Exactly. And this collection is chapter 13 in action. Agape love isn't just a warm, fuzzy feeling you get while contemplating the beauty of the resurrection. It is practically putting your money where your mouth is to buy grain for people you have never even met and who belong to a completely different ethnic group.
He's instituting what we might call systematic generosity. He tells them, on the first day of every week, let each one of you save as he may prosper. The mechanics of this are brilliant.
Right.
He's saying, don't wait until I show up in Corinth and then scramble to find some loose change in the couch cushions out of guilt. Make generosity a calculated systemic habit. Budget for it.
And according to historical sources, this specific instruction is also one of the earliest indications we have that Christians had shifted their primary day of gathering from the Jewish Sabbath on Saturday to the first day of the week, Sunday, to honor the day of Christ's resurrection.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And Paul is saying that giving away your wealth is an integral, non-negotiable part of that worship. Furthermore, it was a tangible economic expression of the unity of the body from chapter 12.
Tying it all back together.
Exactly. The wealthy, socially elite Gentile believers in Corinth sharing their hard-earned resources with the impoverished, marginalized Jewish believers in Jerusalem was the ultimate proof that the foot and the eye actually belonged to the exact same body.
It bridges the ethnic divide, the geographic divide, and the socioeconomic divide all at once. And then, as he prepares to finally close this massive, complex letter, Paul wraps up with a rapid-fire machine gun burst of advice.
He really rapid fires it here.
It reads like a coach grabbing his players by the face mask and giving them their final instructions before they run out onto the field. Watch. Stand firm in the faith. Be courageous. Be strong.
Older translations render that phrase, quit you like men, which essentially meant to act with maturity, bravery, and firmness in the face of intense opposition.
Right.
He is pleading with them to remain hyper-vigilant against the massive egos, the petty divisions, and the false philosophical teachings that were constantly threatening to tear their community apart from the inside out.
But in true Pauline fashion, he immediately balances that intense martial firmness with the ultimate summary of the entire letter. In verse 14, he gives them the final lens through which everything must be filtered.
The final lens.
Let all that you do be done in love. All your profound theology, all your spectacular spiritual gifts, all your bold courage, all your systemic fundraising, if it is not wrapped in, motivated by, and executed through agape, it is completely useless.
That single sentence is the perfect distillation of Paul's entire message to the fractured city of Corinth. Love is the only metric that survives the grave.
We've covered a truly massive amount of ground today. We've journeyed from the chaotic, wealthy, status-obsessed streets of ancient Corinth through the intricate anatomy of human communities into the radical, self-emptying nature of agape love.
It's a journey.
We've navigated the chaotic public meetings and uncomfortable cultural speed bumps, ascended to the eternal hope of the bodily resurrection, and brought it all the way back down to the Tuesday morning logistics of how we spend our money and treat the people standing right in front of us.
Really practical stuff.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week.
I love this part.
In a modern world that constantly, relentlessly encourages us to build our own platforms, to ruthlessly optimize our own lives, to speak our truth regardless of the collateral damage it causes, and to view our physical bodies as either mere tools to be exploited or ultimate burdens to be escaped, this ancient 2,000-year-old letter offers a shockingly radical alternative.
It really does.
What if your greatest actual strength is not found in your intelligence or your visibility, but in how well you serve and protect the weaker, unseen parts of your community? What if true immortality isn't found in making a name for yourself, but in the quiet, unglamorous acts of self-giving love that echo into eternity?
That's something to think about.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.